All right, so a couple things off the top. I noticed not all of you got on and did that class participation on Top Hat that was supposed to be in replacement of using the questions in class on Tuesday. I put up announcements and kind of sent it out multiple times. I will reopen it after class to be to the end of the day, just in case there was any confusion. You need, even if you answer the questions in class on Tuesday, you need to get on and complete what looks like a new assignment on Top Hat called Class Participation 9-10. So it's closed out now. I'll reopen it in between my next two classes and have it set to be due by the end of the day today. Okay. We're going to try to use Top Hat moving forward. I think either they got so many emails from, they told me, you guys can email them. I think they got so many emails and they're tired of getting emails from me. They showed up to my other section on Tuesday in person to try to help me troubleshoot it. And they realized that I'm not lying to them and the Wi-Fi doesn't work. So them telling me they come in here and test it, you know, that's great, but you guys aren't all here when they test it, and that's the problem, right? There's a lot of us. So hopefully, a couple of things to help moving forward. Only be logged on to one device, either be on Chrome or Firefox, and try to get onto Top Hat not through Canvas, but go directly to your search bar and go to tophat.com. If those things don't work, we're going to try it today. We can't get everybody in, so I'm going to do a very similar thing that I did Tuesday and put up what looks like another assignment on Top Hat. It'll be the same questions that we go through at the end of the class today. So if you're here, I'm still incentivizing you to show up and participate because we're going to go through the answers to those questions, right? So you should know the answers if you show up to class to those questions, if it doesn't work today, okay? If it does work, then we'll kind of use it as I described at the beginning of the semester, which is I'll give you guys time to talk to people around you. Hopefully, you know, arrive at the correct answer. There'll be some incentives tied to short class. But if it doesn't work, that assignment, I want to make sure there's still an incentive to be in class. So we'll work through the problem. So you will have the answers if you're here today. Okay. And I'll mention that again once we get to the using those later on, if it works or if it doesn't. Okay. Just as another reminder, module readings in quiz number 3. So quiz number 3 will pop up after my last section today of this course. So it's like 4:30. That'll be due when? End of the day on Monday. The module reading is not quite due at the end of the day. When do you need to have that completed by? 11:50. Yeah. On Top Hat? Yeah, so also there's an issue with it syncing to Canvas. I'm gonna have to do that manually. So as long as you can see your grade on Top Hat, you're fine. Right? It's going to take some time to kind of sync it over to Canvas because it's not set up as kind of the traditional PowerPoint slide. I usually embed them in the PowerPoint slides. That's how it's supposed to be done, but because we're having issues using it in class, I'm going to have to go through and manually do it. So hopefully I can get to it between classes. If not, I should get to it around 1 o'clock today. On the class participation. Show me after class. All right. Any questions before we jump into material? Because we got a decent amount of material to work through today. I'm going to go through the first part pretty quick because I tried to really go, believe it or not, a little slower through the demand stuff. So that the supply stuff, it's really very similar concept. We're just looking at it from a different point of view. Okay. So any questions before we dive into material here? All right. So there we go. Whoops. So we had kind of all of our things that shifted demand. We also have the law of supply and this relationship between not the price and quantity demanded, but price and quantity supplied. So now we're not thinking about it. I think demand is sometimes easier because all of us are consumers. We mostly buy things. Not a lot of us have our own small business, right? But if we did, if we're thinking about a company, if the price of something goes up, is the company going to want to produce more or less of that? More, right? To them, the price is a good thing. They're selling that good, right? So if they can sell it for a higher price, they're going to want to make more and more of it. So this is kind of that direct relationship now. It doesn't work in opposite directions like for demand. Price and quantity supplied are moving in the same direction. We can then think about, just like we had a demand schedule, we could have a supply schedule that shows us this relationship. So as that price goes up by $1, what's happening to the amount that this company, well, I think I said Starbucks here for these orange mocha frappuccinos, right? How much do they want to supply to the market? Well, as that price goes up, they want to supply more and more, right? That quantity supplied is increasing. So just like we did for demand, we can treat price kind of as our y-axis, quantity supplied now as our x-axis, and then just go through and plot those points. Plot that point 0, 0. Plot the point at a quantity of 3, price of 1, then quantity of 6, price of 2. And this is just plotting points on a graph. This is like high school science, and I feel like you probably did this a lot, right? Or high school, like a lot of math courses, you might have done this. So we just plot all those points. And now if we drew a line between them, because we can't, we can see any price in between 0 and 1 just to make it more visible. I'm doing $1 jumps, but you can change the price by a penny, right? So we've got this nice continuous line that kind of runs through these points that we got from our supply schedule, okay? So if I'm looking here, what is going to be the slope of this line? So how do we find slope? Change in y over change in x, rise over run. So if I choose any 2 points here, let's say I choose 2 and 3. What was my change in y? 1. What was my change in x? Looks like it's going from 9 to, actually I said 2 and 3, sorry. It's going from 6 to 9. So the change there would be 3. So my slope is 1/3, right? That change in y over change in x. It's just like we were doing when we're finding slope for any other line, okay? So anytime we have a visual representation of a line, there's an equation behind it. So just like we had the demand equation, we also have the supply equation. Now, we already talked about the slope. What would my intercept be here? It's kind of an easy one. Yeah, right? It starts at 0. And I'll show you an example of here in a second if it didn't, right? So we've got our general form. It looks very similar to when we were looking at quantity demanded. It's just now this quantity for whatever X good we're looking at is quantity supplied. And you'll notice what's going to be true about the slope in the supply equation. It should always be positive now. Demand, it was always negative, right? Because there was inverse relationship. So B is always going to be positive. The intercept value is kind of the price at which there will be nothing supplied to the market, right? Where that quantity supplied is equal to 0. And then our slope tells us the change that we would need in the price to get 1 more unit supplied to the market. Okay? So I'm going to draw this out in a slightly different way and kind of make a slightly different point here. Oops. There we go. So anytime we're kind of graphing out the relationship between quantity supplied and price, it could be that supply starts up here, right? So we can think about why would sometimes, like, why is nothing supplied for the prices down here? Well, let's say I'm a company and I'm producing, I don't know, Sharpie markers. And it costs me the raw materials, all the machinery, per marker, it's going to cost me $1 to make that very first marker, right? So if it's going to cost me $1, if the price that I can sell it for is 50 cents, am I going to produce that? No. This price. So sorry, I got distracted. So if the price is 50 cents, but it's costing me $1, I'm losing money by supplying that to the market. So we're never going to see a quantity supplied until, what if that price is 75 cents? Still no, right? It cost me $1. What if the price is $1? Well, now we would say the producer of the company is indifferent. That's the first price at which they'd be indifferent about supplying that first quantity to the market. So really what this is telling us is, this is going to be like the price that we would need to get above to get that first quantity supplied to the market. So we can think of this supply curve is actually telling us what the marginal cost of the producer is. Because if the marginal cost is $1, I'll only supply this market as soon as the price gets up to $1. Well, then I was using my most efficient workers. I was using my most efficient materials to produce that first unit. So what's going to happen when I produce the second unit? I'm going to have to rely on a little bit less efficient workers and materials. And so the cost is going to be higher. So that's what's reflected in our supply curve is increasing. As I'm going from that first unit to that second, I'll supply the first unit at a lower price. But if you want me to produce a second unit of that good, the price is going to have to be higher, right? I'm not a science person at all. So, but this is the idea. So just like with demand, we had it represent diminishing marginal benefits. Supply is going to represent increasing marginal costs. So that very first unit, I'll supply it at a much lower price than to supply that 10th, right? And you can think about it this way, you know, sometimes it gets kind of tricky when I'm saying like less efficient workers. Think about like something like fast food where everybody's pretty much essentially paid the same, but some workers are more efficient than others, right? So I'm going to hire the most efficient first. So those very first few, you know, customers I serve, I can do that at a lower cost. By the time I'm, you know, serving the 100th customer, now I've got to hire another worker. They're not near as good as that first person, so my costs are increasing. Okay. You can think of it as though each additional unit is going to cost me more money to make the good, right? Any questions on this idea before? I did want to kind of show you an example where it doesn't have to be that the intercept is always 0. It can be some positive value. Okay. All right. So here was kind of our equation that we had for our example. It started at 0, and we already talked about has a slope of 1/3. Okay. So, you know, I already kind of talked through that supply curve represents the marginal cost, or the demand was the consumer's willingness to buy. Supply is the producer or the supplier's willingness to supply that good to the market or willingness to sell, right? So I've already kind of, you know, did this on the dot cam, but supply is essentially our marginal cost. So how can I use that supply equation to find the marginal cost of different goods? Well, let's say I wanted the marginal cost of the 9th good, right? Here we had our supply equation, but we said the price on that supply curve essentially reflects the marginal cost, right? Because it's the first price I would supply that good to the market, and the first price that I would supply the good to the market would be is whatever it cost me to produce that good, that additional cost to produce that good. So we can interpret this price from our supply equation as the marginal cost. Now, if I want to know what's the marginal cost of the 9th unit, all I have to do is plug in that quantity of 9, 0 plus 1/3 times 9. The marginal cost of that 9th unit would be 3, right? And I can find the marginal cost of any unit by just plugging that quantity that I'm interested in finding the marginal cost of into my supply equation. Okay. Oh, there we go. Any questions on that? Okay. It's really a similar thing with demand and marginal benefit. This was just, I want to find the marginal cost of the 9th unit. I could find the marginal cost of the 6th unit as well. Whoops. What would that be? I would just plug a 6 in here. 6 times 1/3 is 2 plus 0. Notice going from 6 to 9, my marginal costs are increasing. Yep. Any other questions on this before we kind of jump back into the slides here? Okay. All right. So you could go through, if you wanted to, these different quantities, plug them in and get these marginal costs, right? Now you'll notice it's kind of helpful to have the supply equation, because if I go back, oh, there we go. Oh, yeah, that 9th unit did have, what was the price? 3, that represented the marginal cost. So I can get the marginal cost from my supply schedule as well. The only problem is, well, what if I have a price or a quantity of 2? Well, that's not one of the values I had in my table. But once I come up with my supply equation, right, I can just plug that value of 2 in here. 2 times 1/3 plus 0 would be 2/3, or 0.66. So we can grab those marginal costs from the supply schedule, but usually it's not going to be as complete. Using that equation is probably a much easier way to find the marginal cost of any quantity or any number of units we're interested in. Okay. Any questions on that before I keep moving here? All right. So we've already kind of talked about supply is increasing. It represents that it's costing us, you know, the additional cost is increasing as I produce more and more of something. Okay. So once again, I might move this a little quick because this is really, we've already talked about this. So with demand, we had kind of every individual's demand curve. If we wanted market demand, what did we do? We just, added those up. So we added them all up to get our market demand. Same kind of thing for individual market supply. So let's say I've now got 2 companies, right? And I've got kind of the supply schedule for both of them. All I would do is at every price say, okay, if the price is $1, Starbucks would supply 3 of these drinks, Jitterbug 2. So my market supply would be 5. All I'm doing is adding up every individual supply curve to get my market supply. Okay. Any questions? This shouldn't be, like I said, it's really, really similar to what we did with demand, right? This isn't too crazy. So we've got our market supply curve. This represents the relationship between the price of this good and the quantity supplied of that good. So changes in the price of the good you're looking at will move you to different points on your supply curve. So this is very similar to quantity demanded and demand. Here, movements along our supply curve, that's just as the price of the good changes, we're moving to different quantity supply. If something other than the price of that good changes, that might cause a shift in the entire supply curve. So that, at every single price, we see an increase or a decrease in quantity supply. Okay. So what are some of these things, right? So we're holding all these other things constant so that the supply curve was just the relationship between the price and quantity supply. What are these things we are holding constant? Yeah, so we've got shifts. So I've got some drawings you can kind of go back to here, but I think I can do a better job than PowerPoint. So let's try to kind of fill these out. And there's a bunch of dots here because I'm pressing too hard. Apparently, I'm excited about this, I guess. So let's first do, I've got some supply curve, and we'll call this my old supply curve. What if, and we'll go use this example because we can kind of go through this slide quickly. What if I have a decrease in the number of firms who are now producing orange mocha frappuccinos or whatever the good is? If I have fewer firms, I'm now adding up fewer supply curves. So what's going to happen to my market supply? It's going to decrease, or people are kind of correctly saying it works a little bit. This is why I said left and rightward shifts, because notice what's going to happen. If I have a decrease in supply, that means that every price, the quantity supplied is going to go down. So a decrease in supply is this leftward shift. So the reason why I use left and rightward is because what does it actually look like supply is doing here? Looks like it's moving up, right? So it's not as intuitive as demand, right? Thinking about up and down, we have to think about what this is really representing. It's representing that every price, quantity supplied is lower. That is a decrease. Another way to kind of help you remember this, like I said, I would just stick with thinking about it as leftward shifts or decreases for both supply and demand. Increases are rightward shifts. But you can also think about it as, well, this is actually getting closer. Like let's say supply started out here. It's getting closer to 0, right? It's moving towards 0 or moving to the left towards 0. Now, if instead, so this is going to be our supply decrease. What if instead I had, and this one's, I think, maybe easy too, we can kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Remember, what does supply represent to us? Marginal costs. So let's say I'm producing some good, and all of a sudden the government comes in and says, you know what, we think you're paying your workers too low of an amount, we're increasing the minimum wage. So now your production process, you've actually seen an increase in the marginal costs, right? Actually, I don't want to do an increase, sorry. Let's say the government comes in, this is a better example. Let's say they come in and say, we actually like free markets. We had a minimum wage, we're now going to get rid of it. You can actually pay your workers less, right? So what's happening to my marginal costs is they're now decreasing, right? So if my marginal costs are decreasing, what do you think is going to happen to the entire supply curve? It's going to increase, right? Because remember, whatever my marginal cost was, that was the price that I would first be willing to supply that good to the market. So if you lower my marginal cost, I'll now supply it at a lower price. So we would see this rightward shift or an increase in supply. At every single price, the quantity supplied is now higher. Right? So once again, you can also think about this as I'm moving away from 0, right? I'm increasing. So I get it that it's a little bit tricky with supply because up and down, you don't want to think about it as up and down, right? Increases are decreases. We want to connect to increase to the right, decrease to the left. Okay? Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay? And like I said, I think just seeing me draw it out maybe is better than just these that I had in you can draw it with the arrow here and it can kind of get confusing, which is why I wanted to kind of make sure I connect this idea of leftward, rightward shifts. So I already mentioned this one, but what are some things that can shift supply? So we now know how supply decreases and how supply increases, but what causes it to increase and decrease? Well, I mentioned a couple, but input prices are going to be a major one, right? So anytime I have an increase in input prices, so this would be like if I'm making, I don't know, phones and then all of a sudden microchips increase in price, right? The microchips that we're getting from overseas, all of a sudden they jack the prices up. The input prices went up. It's now more costly for me to make this good. So am I more or less willing to supply that to the market? If it costs me more to make it, I'm going to be less likely, right? So we're going to see a decrease in supply anytime our input prices go up, okay? You can also think about it if my input prices go down, right? So let's say I find some new technology. This was a great example of like automobiles, right? The assembly line, right? The idea of developing this thing where everyone's specializing on a part, and we're passing this product along down the road. That made it much cheaper to produce that automobile. So what happened? We saw a huge increase in the supply, right? So anytime we can lower our input prices, we can increase our supply. So I don't think this one's too crazy, but you can think about this as like sugar. If all of a sudden sugar prices go up, we would see a decrease in the supply of candy because you can't make candy without sugar. Not good candy, right? And then you can think about these orange mocha frappuccinos. If all of a sudden the cost of milk goes way down, well, we now see that these companies might be willing to supply more to the market or an increase in supply. So I think this one's probably one of the easier ones, right? If it's more costly to make something, supply is going to decrease. If it's less costly, it's going to increase. Okay? Any questions on this one before we keep moving? Yeah, that one's not too bad. Another way of thinking about these input prices, and I'll make this connection because I think maybe seeing things in a different way sometimes helps. So if I instead think about at every single price, if it's now, well, every single one of these prices, it's now cheaper for me to make this good, I'm going to supply more. So my supply curve shifts out like this. But another way of thinking about this, and I don't have these arrows in here, but I want to connect this idea, so I will take the time. I do want to kind of move a little quick, but I think it's worthwhile here. So if I'm thinking about a supply curve, if I've seen that maybe this is easier way to think about it. If my input prices go up, so remember this is kind of representing my marginal cost. That means that at every single quantity, if my costs are now higher, in order for me to supply this unit to the market, what's going to have to be true about the price? It's going to have to be a little bit higher. What about to supply this unit to the market? Well, now the price is going to have to be a little bit higher. So you can think about it, this decrease in supply, this leftward shift, is also kind of representing that to produce the same quantity or supply the same quantity to the market, you're now going to have to see an increase in the price of that good. Right? So just a different way of thinking about this supply shift. But I think with input prices, you can kind of think about, increasing my marginal costs, right? My new marginal costs at every quantity now are a little bit higher. Okay? So just another way of looking at it. Like I said, sometimes I try to do things multiple ways. It connects, with this way it might connect with some people. The original way I did it might connect with others. So we've got this input price shifter. We also have kind of technology. I'm not going to waste a lot of time on this because it's essentially the same thing as input prices. If I see an improvement in technology, what's happening to my input prices? Generally, they're going to fall, right? So this is really synonymous with input prices. But a lot of times we'll think about, it's not technically that like our raw materials became cheaper. It's just that we saw an advancement in technology of how to use those raw materials, right? So you can kind of group those two in together if you really want to. Okay? I already mentioned this one too, and I'll work through it kind of quick because it's pretty easy, I think. If we have more sellers of a good, what's happening to my supply curve? It's increasing, right? We're getting market supply by adding up each company or each individual supply curve. So if I have more individual sellers, What's going to happen to my market supply? Well, I'm adding up more companies. I'm going to have a higher supply curve, right? So more sellers kind of lead to increases in supply. If all of a sudden, I don't know, there's a good that people don't really want anymore, and we start to see fewer and fewer companies kind of produce that good, I see a decrease in the number of sellers. What's going to happen to my supply curve? Shift left or decrease, right? I have fewer companies now to add up to get market supply. I'm going to have a lower supply curve or a decrease in supply. So this is kind of same kind of thing we talked about with consumers and demand. So this one's not terribly crazy. Take a little bit more time with this one. So this is kind of a catch-all. It's going to be specific to whatever good you're looking at, but market expectations can sometimes impact supply. So for instance, what I use here, if it's going to be a cold winter, yeah, I think it's going to be a colder than predicted weather on average. And I think that people are going to need to use a lot more natural gas. What might happen to my current supply? Well, I know that in the future, people are really going to be willing to pay a lot more. It's going to be really cold. They're really going to want natural gas. So I'm thinking, this market expectation leads me to thinking that the price might be higher in the future. So as a company, if I think the price is going to be higher tomorrow, what's going to happen to my supply today? We're going to hold on to it. So my current supply is actually going to decrease. I'm not going to want to sell it today. So market expectations, which then lead to price expectations. If I expect the price is going to be higher in the future, I'm going to try to stop putting my good on the market today, stockpile it so I can sell it when the price is higher. Because as a producer, when I sell something, the amount of money I get is price, right? So I want to make sure I'm selling it and supplying it to the market when the price is high, right? So higher expected prices in the future, lower current supply. Or said differently, if I think that the price is going to plummet, right, a couple months from now, let's say I was a producer of fidget spinners and I'm like, look, this thing, it's going to die any day. We're not sure, right? We know the price is going to drop here at some point. What do we want to try to do today? Get rid of all of our products, right? We want to supply everything to the market because we have no belief that the price is going to stay this high. We only think it's going to fall. So we think the price is going to be lower in the future. Current supply would actually increase, right? So this is kind of our higher or lower expected prices. Kind of, it's the exact opposite of what we talked about for consumers, because for consumers, price was like a bad thing, right? That's what you have to hand money over for. For the producers, it's a good thing. That's the amount of money they're getting. Right? So they just kind of work in opposite directions of when we talk about price expectations for demand. Okay. Any questions on this? Yeah. So, yeah, so I would have to specifically tell you if the expectation is coming from a producer or a consumer, right? If we're, consumers didn't realize that the price of fidget spinners was going to drop, they might not have changed their demand curve at all. I would have to specifically tell you who is expecting the higher or lower prices. In fact, I think we'll have time today. We're going to get kind of simultaneous shifts and equilibrium, and we could actually say, what if both have this price expectation change? What's going to happen? Yep. So it's a good question. I'll try to hold on to that for later. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Oh, perfect. All right. Oh, I guess my animations are turned off my arrows, so we'll have some floating arrows before we get there. But let's say I've got substitutes in production. So this is going to be the exact opposite of what we're thinking about for consumers as well. So if I could produce two goods, and I think generally, the example I like is, what if I'm producing, like I have a field, right? I can plant corn or I can plant soybeans, right? Let's say I was, currently planting corn, right? I'm thinking about the market for corn. If the price of soybeans goes up, so some other good that's a substitute, right? And it's not a substitute in consumption here, it's a substitute in what I can produce. I can use my field to either produce corn or soybeans. So if I'm looking at that market for corn and all of a sudden the price of soybeans goes up, what's going to happen to the supply of corn? All farmers, if the price of soybeans is going up, they're going to be more likely to plant soybeans and not plant corn, right? So if we have substitutes in production, when the price of the other good goes up, the good that we're looking at, well, people actually stop producing that because it's now relatively a lower price. Now they can't make as much money planting corn in their field. They can make more if they switch over to soybeans. Okay? So here we've kind of got this opposite direction in terms of if the price of a substitute goes up, we actually see a decrease in the supply of the good we're looking at. And I say a substitute in production. So it gets kind of hard to think about it once again, because we usually consume things, right? But when producers produce things, you can set up, if I had a 3D printer, I could produce a bunch of different things, right? So I'm going to want to produce the thing that I can sell for the highest price. So anytime there's something that all of a sudden, maybe people start to all of a sudden the price goes way up for this one good, I might switch my production process over to instead 3D print that thing, right? So this is the idea of substitute goods. We could go in the opposite direction as well. If all of a sudden soybeans, like the price plummets, right? What are more and more farmers going to want to do? Plant corn in their field, we'll see an increase in the supply of corn. Okay? So this is the idea of substitutes in production, right? Let me think where I'm at here, if there's anything else I want to say. And I'll go through, I'll actually give you an example, and you'll have it in the slides, but I think maybe this will help me working it out this way. All right, so just to kind of have that example, if the price of soybeans was going up, we said the supply of corn is going to go down. Right? But what if I have what we call complements in production? So I always struggle to come up with really relevant and good examples for this. And then I was at, not that any of you should be there yet, but there's a distillery in Indianapolis called Hotel Tango. It's like run by expats or ex-Marines. And they did this thing where during the pandemic, what do you think happened to the price of hand sanitizer? Skyrocketed, right? Well, lo and beknownst to me, in the production process of whiskey, you get a bunch of this just pure like alcohol that you can't put in the, like it's like rubbing alcohol, right? You can't put it into the drink. So it kind of pulls out some of this like pure alcohol out of the whiskey product. And then usually they didn't have anything, they didn't know what to do with it. They usually just threw it away, right? It's not useful. Well, guess what you can use that pure alcohol to make? Hand sanitizer. So when the price of hand sanitizer went up, now what are they incentivized to do? Produce even more whiskey, right? Because now they're not just getting that product of whiskey, they're getting a secondary product that they can now sell for even more money. So a dumb example of this that they probably textbook uses, or you always hear, is like if I produce 2x4s like lumber, what's a complement in production I might get from that process? Yeah, so that's another, but I don't know. That to me, that's not as cool of an example of those, right? Yeah. So we're not talking about equilibriums at all yet. This is just going to be a shift in the supply, right? We'll eventually talk about how is the price of whiskey determined and what would that shift in supply actually do. All right, any questions on this before we keep moving here? Because I do want to get to, and then this is just kind of a generalized summary of what I just wrote on the board here. Same kind of thing. It works in the opposite direction as well. If I have a complementary good, but all of a sudden it's, hand sanitizer isn't, you can't sell it for as much now, well, then the supply of whiskey goes down, right? Because that complementary good isn't as valuable for me to sell. Where? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. No, you're right. I copy and pasted this and didn't change it. Thank you for pointing that out. Complement in production. I was trying to save myself a little bit of time. There we go. All right. Any other questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. All right. Once again, this one I'll go through kind of quick because I think it's kind of easy. If all of a sudden we have taxes on supply, that's going to decrease supply. Why? What is a tax to a producer? It's a cost. So all it is, once again, we could group a lot of these in together. Technology, input prices, taxes. Taxes is essentially an input price, right? If I make something in order to make it, to produce it, I have to pay a tax to the government to just simply produce this good. That's going to increase my cost. That's going to decrease supply, right? On the flip side, so gasoline, kind of carbon emissions taxes, subsidies, right, are going to be when companies are given money to produce something. So a real big subsidy that I don't know the current state of it, but I do know in the past 20 years, there was huge subsidies. And if you drive around Indiana, you'll see this play out. They used to give really, really big subsidies putting up windmills, right? They thought this was going to be revolutionary and get all this extra energy. So they were giving tons of money. So what do you think happened to the supply of windmills? It went up. Why? Because when I get a subsidy as a producer, well, let's say it cost me, I don't know, $100,000 to put up that windmill. If the government gives me $100,000, what did it actually cost me? Nothing. It's lowering my marginal cost. So taxes, you can think of just like we had an increase in input prices, subsidies, we're going to see a decrease in input prices. Decreases in input prices are actually a increase in supply. And so once again, always kind of think of, if you can think of an example that kind of really makes sense to you, anchor that example to this concept. To me, the windmill one makes sense. You drive around Indiana and you see all these windmills everywhere. Why? Well, it's not because these companies are making much of money actually producing the energy from a windmill. They got huge subsidies from the government. So you saw this explosion of supply of windmills, right? Any other questions on this? And like I said, you could really tie this into input prices. So here's kind of a summary of all the things that shift supply, right? So all the things that we kind of worked through, they're all kind of summarized. I put them up in this one slide. Rightward shifts are increases in supply. Leftward shifts are decreases. Okay. Any questions on supply? Because we're going to kind of change topics. Well, not complete topics, but we're going to kind of match supply and demand together. Okay. All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about is how the price of a good is determined. Okay. So we know that higher prices, people want to put more out there on the market, but as prices get higher, there's fewer and fewer people that want to buy it. So we have this kind of competing effects, right? So how do we see the ultimate price of a good actually be determined? Why is the price of an iPhone what it is, right? How many units will we see produced and consumed out there on the market, right? What are the number of actual iPhones that are produced and sold, right? So short story, put this the shortest way possible. It's going to be where our supply and demand curve intersect. But let's think about why. I might be wasting some of my slides here. But like I said, I think it's beneficial for you, not just for me to draw these out and you see me kind of work through it, but also this is a really good thing to take notes on. I was talking with someone the other day, and actually a professor, and she had like a brain thing where she had almost like rewired her brain, and it was like a neurological condition. And so she was talking about when she was going through all this stuff, and she's a professor, and she said, when she was going through relearning everything, the process of actually putting pen to paper and writing something down actually greatly accelerated her ability to kind of get back to where she was, right? And that she could just kind of read things and that would be helpful. She could watch things, but actually writing down, even watching the same thing, but writing it down as well, helped rebuild those neural pathways. So copying down what I'm doing up here will help you build those neural pathways, right? And if I'm saying that incorrect and there's any, I don't know, neurology majors here, I apologize, but I think that's the lingo, right? So before on our x-axis, I was doing quantity demanded and quantity supplied. Really, we can think of those are both representing just the quantity, right? So I'm going to put quantity on my x-axis here, price up here. We know that we've got an increasing supply curve, and that's because what is increasing as I produce more of the good? My marginal costs. Supply represents those marginal costs. We also had a decreasing demand curve, right? So we have like iPhones. There's all these various prices that an iPhone could be. There's all these different quantity demanded and quantity supplied that would be associated with those prices. So demand was decreasing because we said, what is decreasing for the consumer? My marginal benefit. What does this look like? We've already done this, right? How do we make optimal decisions? We continue to buy something, we said, as long as the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. If we're out there on the market, how do consumers and producers kind of cooperate or make a decision about, am I going to produce this good or are you going to buy it? Well, for this very first unit, that consumer is willing to pay a lot of money for it. The marginal benefit is very high. The marginal cost is really low. So there's definitely a range of values that we can come to an agreement on where we're both going to be better off here, right? So even if the price was like right here, well, this price is way below the consumer's marginal benefit, and it's still above the marginal cost of the producers. Both of them like that. Okay, Well, what about the next unit of this good? Marginal benefit is still greater than the marginal cost. We can find a price that works for both of us. Both of us are better off. This process continues up until we get to the point where they're exactly equal to each other. Now, what is true about both the producer and consumer? When this good is produced and consumed, each person is, I've used this word, indifferent, right? We're no better or no worse off. So we say that the market will go kind of see transactions up to this point, right? Now, so what we call that is our equilibrium quantity. I usually write this as Q star. You could put QE, and I might have used E in the slides. I know that I'll do this throughout the semester just by not thinking about it, right? So it's just difference in notation. It's going to represent our equilibrium quantity, okay? Now, why do we know we don't go past this point? If this unit was produced on the market and then consumed, what's true about the marginal benefit and the marginal cost? Marginal cost is above marginal benefit. There's no price in this range. Notice if this was the price, the producer is actually worse off because the price is below their marginal cost, and the consumer is worse off because the price is above their marginal benefit. So we know that the market will stop at that point where the marginal cost of the last unit supplied is exactly the same as the marginal benefit of the last unit consumed. And then, because people are indifferent at this point, this ends up being, once again, so two different ways of notation. PE or P star representing, here's our equilibrium price. So marginal cost of the producers, marginal benefits of the consumers will lead us to this equilibrium quantity and price in the market. This will be the price that we see, the sticker price of the iPhone. Okay. I think that was the good I was using. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? Yeah. Yeah, those are the different issues. Like I explain it this way, but in practice, we never see these points actually occur. This is our equilibrium. This is the quantity price you see in the market. We'll dive into some stuff later in the semester. You could complicate this model to think about. There's actually, like, as we're working towards this point, maybe there's like negotiations happening here, and what do those look like? But ultimately, we're just concerned for right now is where does the market arrive at? What is the equilibrium quantity price that we see as a result of these consumers' marginal benefits and producers' marginal costs? Yeah, good question. Any other questions before we keep moving? All right, so go through this kind of quick because we've already talked about this. I drew it out for you, right? It's just going to be where supply and demand intersect, right? So here we have an equilibrium price and quantity of what? 3 and 15, right? So it shouldn't be too tough. Now, what if I had a supply and demand schedule? Now, I've got the graph up here, and we can easily see that the equilibrium price is 3 and the equilibrium quantity here, where supply is equal to demand, is 15. How could I get that from this chart? Well, if I'm going through, I'm looking for where is the price at which the quantity demanded is exactly the same as the quantity supplied. So let's say the price was $1. The quantity demanded, people want to buy 24, but how many are being supplied to the market? 5. So we'll eventually talk about this. I don't know if we'll get there today, but this would be kind of like a shortage, right? More people want to buy this good than how many units the company's putting out, right? And so as a result, well, what's going to happen? People are willing to pay a little bit more for this good, so we go up to $2. Well, now at this higher price, some people are still willing to buy this good, but some of them dropped out, right? Some of them weren't willing to pay too. So 18 people want to buy it, only 10, at this higher price, we've convinced some more companies to produce more of this good, but there's still a gap, right? If we get that price to increase to 3, well, now we've only got 15 people who want to buy this good. 15 suppliers now want to supply it, or they want to supply 15 units, and we get this equilibrium quantity, of 3. So you can use the demand and supply schedule, and there to identify the equilibrium, you're just looking for the price at which the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. That's essentially what that intersection point represents, right? It's the price at which the point we're at on the supply curve, quantity supplied, is the exact same as our quantity demand. Okay? At any other quantity, at any other price, you think about if I was at 2, that quantity supplied is not the same as my quantity demanded. Okay? Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. So at this point, I also want to work through this with you. And then we will transition, I believe, to thinking about how these shifts will impact the equilibrium. I have to remind myself what's on that slide. So let's say I had demand and supply equations. So I think it's easy to see an equilibrium on a graph. And I don't think it's like terribly difficult looking at that table to find the price where the quantity supplied is the same as the quantity demanded. But what if I had a supply and demand equation? Okay. So a couple questions we could start to ask, and I've already worked through some of these, but I just want to kind of reiterate. What is the demand curve? What does this price represent? Marginal benefit. So I said I could think of this price as representing the marginal benefit. So if I wanted the marginal benefit of the fifth unit, what is all I need to do? Plug in a 5 into quantity. 5 times 5, subtract that from 100. I would get the marginal benefit of that fifth unit would be 75, right? 100 minus 5 times 5. Okay. What if I wanted the marginal cost of the third unit? What do I do? What represents marginal costs? The supply curve. The price at which the company is willing to supply is going to be when it exactly hits their marginal cost. So we said we can think of that price from our marginal cost curve is going to represent our, that price from our supply curve is going to represent our marginal costs. Okay? So all I would do is plug in a quantity of 3 here. 3 times 15 is what? 45 plus 20. I'd have a marginal cost at that unit of 3 of 65. Okay? So we can use these supply and demand equations to find marginal costs, marginal benefits. We can also use them to find the equilibrium point. So can anyone anticipate how would I do this? Yeah, if we're looking for the point in the graph where the 2 lines intersect, well, those lines, here's the equations behind those lines. So the point where they intersect is the point where those 2 equations are giving me the exact same value, where the marginal benefit and the marginal cost are exactly the same. So all I'm going to do to find that equilibrium is set supply equal to demand. So 100 minus 5Q is going to be equal to 20 plus 15Q. And here's probably the extent to which we will kind of push algebra in this class. We will sometimes have to solve for an unknown, right? So how would I solve this equation? Well, I can subtract 20 from both sides, right? I get 80 minus 5Q. This cancels, is equal to 15Q. I add 5Q to both sides. I didn't leave myself enough room. And I get what? 80 is equal to 20Q. I then would do what? Hopefully this is like easy, not terrible math for you guys. 80 over 20, I get that my equilibrium quantity is 4. Okay. Now I've got my equilibrium quantity now. How would I find my equilibrium price? Well, if I know this is the equilibrium quantity, that's going to be the quantity at which the marginal cost and marginal benefit are the same value. So I really could go ahead and plug this into either one of my supply or demand equations. So let's kind of just do that here. So I've got my equilibrium quantity. My demand equation was 100 minus 5Q. So if I plug 4 in here, what's going to be the price? It's like 80. What about my supply equation? If I had chose that one, 20 plus 15Q, if I plug 4 into here, what do I get? 60 plus 20, I also get 80. So it doesn't matter which one I use. Once I have that equilibrium quantity, I can plug it into either my supply or demand equation to find my equilibrium price. Okay. So almost guarantee, I wrote the quiz, so I am guaranteeing you. You'll see a question like this where I give you a supply and demand equation on the quiz and then ask you for the equilibrium quantity and price. Okay. Any questions on kind of this before we keep moving? Okay with this? We're starting to get scared a little bit, no? Okay. All right. So this a little, there we go. So we're going to kind of punt on shortages and surpluses. I am guessing we're not going to get to them today. So if we don't get to them, there's no, well, spoiler alert, there's not going to be a question on the quiz for them because I kind of knew that we might kind of have to put this off and start next week with it. And next week's material, I should have a little bit less, so it should be able to cover that material quicker anyways. But there is one question on the practice problems, and I'll put an announcement up. I think off the top of my head, it's either 15 or 16. If it references a surplus or shortage, don't worry about that one. Like I said, we didn't get to it yet, so I'm not going to put a quiz question up there about surpluses or shortages. Okay. So the next thing we want to do is analyze how shifts in supply and demand, how does that impact the price of the good? Right? So here's our general steps. Well, first we need to figure out something else has changed. Does that shift supply or does it shift demand? Right? And sometimes the answer can be both. We'll eventually get to. Once we know what's shifting, what direction is it shifting? Is it shifting to the left or to the right? Is it decreasing or increasing? And then after we see that shift, what's going to happen? Is it going to increase or decrease our equilibrium price and quantity? So we'll work through a couple examples of this. So the first one we'll do is kind of a demand shift, right? So I left these slides blank because I wanted to. From here. So let's say, when I wrote down some examples that I thought would be interesting. Let's say I've got, and I don't know, chicken wings, chicken whatever. Let's just some unit of chickens, right? And there's a number of chickens that we want to see out there that we're using for food. And then we've got the price of chickens, right? So initially, I've got some supply curve, some demand curve. I can identify, and here I'm going to call this Q1 representing the equilibrium quantity and the equilibrium price that we're starting out at, right? If you want to write 1 as old and then I'll end up using 2 as new, you can use the words old and new. Generally, I'm going to kind of think about as numbers go up, this is like time is progression, right? So here is the first time period. Now something has changed. What has changed? Let's say the price of a substitute in consumption, right? So here we're just thinking about if beef and chicken, it was just a substitute in consumption, right? If the price of beef goes up, what's going to happen if it's a substitute in consumption in the market for chicken? So substitutes in consumption tells me which curve is going to shift. Demand, right? Consumption, consumers are demand. If it was producers, then we'd be thinking about supply. So we know that demand is going to shift. Anytime you see that word consumer, instantly know that you're shifting demand, right? So if all of a sudden for consumers, beef at the, you go to the Kroger and beef is a lot more expensive, which it is recently, what do you think starts to happen to demand for chicken? It increases, right? Or a shift to the right, right? So now you kind of think about this as, I forgot to put my original demand curve was right here. What's happened to my equilibrium price and quantity? Yeah, my equilibrium quantity is higher, but also my equilibrium price is going to end up being higher, right? And we kind of think about why. When people demand more product, the producers can get away with charging a higher price. That's not perfect logic, but that's kind of a more of like an intuitive description of what's going on. When demand is increasing, that will push the price of a product up, and it will also push up the number of units we see sold in the market. It kind of makes sense, right? People want more, they're willing to pay more, and we see more people buying this good. What if instead, what did I do here? I had some other good examples. I had, let's kind of give us, let's do, I don't know, it's a fun one. We could do, yeah, we'll do this and then write on. Let's say that chicken is like an inferior good, just for the sake of argument, right? Let's say it's an inferior good, and all of a sudden, I see that overall income in the US is going up. So I have my original supply curve, my original demand curve. I've got my equilibrium quantity, my equilibrium price here. If for an inferior good, what is happening, right? First of all, changes in income, consumers' income, what curve is going to shift? Demand, right? Which way is it going to shift? For an inferior good, if I have more money, I actually buy. Yeah, so we're going to see a decrease in demand. What's that going to do to my equilibrium quantity and price? Has the exact opposite effects of a demand increase, right? If demand decreases, will push that equilibrium price and quantity down. Once again, it's kind of intuitive. If people don't want to buy this good as much, they're not willing to pay as much, so the price is going to drop, and they're not buying as much of it. They don't have as high of a demand as they did before. Any questions on this one before we keep moving? Yeah. So I specifically said substitutes in what? Consumption, right? That's where it does matter. If I'm telling you substitutes in production, demand isn't shifting. What would be shifting? Supply.
Is the second one when the S&P goes down?
So this went with this.
Yeah.
This went with this. This was an income change, right? We saw income go up, and we had chicken, which I said was an inferior good. Yep. See another ham somewhere? No. Okay. All right. So we can do demand shifts. We can also do supply shifts, right? So let's say I've got quantity price, I've got my demand curve, and we'll kind of call this my old supply curve, right? Oh, sorry, I'm writing too fast. You're right. So this is going to be my old supply curve, and here's my demand curve. Thank you. So what example did I have? Let's do price expectations, right? So no matter what good this is, if all of a sudden that producers expect, let's say gasoline, the producers of gasoline, the consumers don't have any difference in their price expectations, but the producers, the companies think that gasoline is going to be much more expensive a couple months from now. What's going to happen to the current supply, right? So producers' price expectations are that the price is going to be higher in the future. What's going to happen to my supply curve? Yeah, it's going to, current supply is actually going to decrease, right? Because I'm going to stockpile my gasoline and try to sell it when the price is higher. So what was the old equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price? It's right here. So now with this new supply curve, where's my equilibrium quantity and price? My price is now higher, all right? And the quantity is actually going to be lower. Okay. So demand shifts, I think, are a little bit easier, more intuitive to think about. These changes in price and quantity, when we have supply changes, they're not like both decreasing, right? Price is going up, but the quantity, equilibrium quantity is going down here. Questions on this? A few murmurings. Okay with this?
Wait.
Who said wait?
Yeah. Wait, is the quantity, is there going to be less amount of products?
Yeah, if you want to intuitively think about it, there's just fewer people putting this product out in the market now. We're going to see the quantity in the market fall. And because there's fewer sellers, right? The sellers that are existing are going to be the ones that they can kind of get away with. They know if there's less in the market, we're at a lower unit, that marginal benefit of consumers is higher, so they can get away with charging consumers more money. That's not a perfect explanation, but if you want to kind of think about it that way, yeah. Any other questions for you? So, for the sake of time, I'm not going to drop. Well, you could do the exact same thing, put it on this one. You could do a supply, call this S3, right? Supply increase. What is that going to do? Let's say we kind of started here. A supply increase is going to do what? Increase my quantity, my equilibrium quantity, but it's going to decrease that equilibrium price. Now, I would not suggest always kind of drawing some of the same graph. I'm just going to do that to kind of show you put it all in one place. In practice, you're only ever going to have one thing that shifts supply at a time. I'm never going to say like multiple things happen and okay, that's decrease the supply, that increase the supply. You know, it's only going to be one at a time. Okay. Any questions on this before I get the most complicated part of today? Okay. So if we can look at shifts in either one of these, we can also look at simultaneous shifts. Okay. So simultaneous shifts are pretty tough, right? So let's think about if first we could do the two changes we did earlier, whatever good we're thinking about. But let's say I have a decrease in supply. Okay? So that decrease in supply is going to put my kind of new supply curve to the left. Right? So what impacts is that going to have on my equilibrium price and quantity? I'm not going to plot those points because we're also going to have a shift in demand, which is going to change the equilibrium as well. But if we just think about, I had this thing change, maybe input prices went up, so supply decreases. What's going to happen to my equilibrium quantity and price? My equilibrium quantity, oh, that would scare me. My equilibrium quantity is lower, right? Here, right? So this supply decrease is going to push my quantity down. What's happening to the equilibrium price? It's going up. So here's the impact of that supply decrease. What if at the same time, I saw this, normal good, and I saw an increase in income? Well, and I'll draw this very specifically here. So I have simultaneous shifts, a shift in supply and shift in demand at the same time. Income was going up, and so were input prices. What is the effect of that demand increase going to have on my equilibrium quantity? Equilibrium quantity is going to increase. What's happening to the equilibrium price? It's also increasing. So now notice if I'm trying to look at these and they happen at the same time, what would my total effect be, right? Because both of these things are happening at the same time. Well, for sure, I know what's going to happen to price, right? What's going to happen to price? Both these changes were pushing price up. So automatically, I know that price is going to increase. What's going to happen to quantity? I don't know, right? Or we say it's indeterminate, right? I don't know what's going to happen because I need to know something about the size of these shifts, right? And we're not going to dive into that, right? We're not going to give you like different size. So the most that we're going to push is if we have simultaneous effects that are pushing something in opposite directions, we say the change is indeterminate. And in fact, I drew it in such a way, if you had equal shifts, notice what could happen to the equilibrium quantity. I tried to draw this perfect, but it's a little bit off. You could actually have equilibrium quantity be exactly the same, right? Now, that equilibrium price, right, because you're now looking at your new supply and new demand curve, that equilibrium price is definitely going to be higher, but you could actually end up with the equilibrium quantity doesn't change at all. Now, if I didn't draw my demand curve as large of a shift, notice where would my new equilibrium point be? At a lower quantity. What if I drew my demand shift a little bit higher? Well, now my equilibrium quantity would be higher. So it really matters what the size of the shifts are if these two simultaneous shifts are pushing something in opposite directions.
What's the
Total effect. I'm just abbreviating it there. If you want to write it out, total effect there. Yeah, sorry. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. Yeah. Yep. If you ever have simultaneous shifts that are pushing price in the opposite direction, same thing. We would put a question mark or the change is indeterminate. Now, I'm not going to work through every combination, right? But I did provide every combination kind of here in the slides, right? So here is just if we have single shifts. We then said multiple things can change. I have an actual example here, which maybe I'll work through one more if we have time here. I want to try to use those top hat questions first. But basically, it's a market for asphalt. So let's say all of a sudden the price of oil goes up. we see an increase in the price of a substitute gravel, right? These are going to have two impacts. The first, if an input price is going up, what's happening to supply? It's decreasing, right? If we have an increase in the price of gravel, a substitute, and I really should have been to be a little bit more, I'll update this slide after class, substitute in consumption, right? What's going to happen to the demand for asphalt? If the price of a substitute goes up, the demand for the other good would also go. So if you increase the price of gravel, gravel is now more costly. What do more people likely make their driveway with? Asphalt. So what's happening to demand for asphalt? It's going up, right? So we have this decrease in supply, increase in demand. That's exactly what I drew out for you here, right? Right. So what you would do is you would want to identify what each shift, what impact it had. I was using arrows when I was drawing it out, but you can write the words here if you want. And we determined that both of these changes led to higher equilibrium prices, but pushed quantity in different direction. So what's the combined or total effect? This is where we said we know equilibrium price will be higher, but we don't know what's going to happen to the equilibrium quantity. So this is the, just putting a product to the actual kind of drawing that I went through here in the slides. And then, so I jumped the gun here. I did this kind of ahead of time. This is what this blank slide was for. We kind of already worked through this. And here's your different combinations, right? So if you have both supply and demand increasing, this is kind of depicting that. You always know your new equilibrium quantity is going to be somewhere higher, but the equilibrium price, we don't know. Right? If you have a demand and supply decrease, well, that if you have that simultaneous change, you know the quantity is going to be lower. But once again, you don't know what's going to happen to the equilibrium price. It could be anywhere in this range. And then the other two, anytime you have them working in opposite directions, you know either the price is going to go up or down, but you don't know what's going to happen to that equilibrium quantity. So there's, 4 different combinations of these simultaneous shifts you could work through. I think working through those practice problems, like I said, hopefully I have time to work through one more here at the end. I think working through more of them is helpful. Going to those CL sessions, they'll work through some. In fact, I'll throw something together this afternoon and send it to them so they have additional examples of these simultaneous shifts so that they have kind of a bank of even more than the practice problems. They've got a couple extra that they could work through as well if you have kind of questions on those, okay? All right, I also put up kind of a shorthand summary. I typically like to write them this way. I don't know, arrows, it just helps me visualize it. So if I've got a demand increase and a supply increase, what is that going to do? Well, I know it's going to push the quantity up, but I don't know what's going to happen to the price, right? So this is just kind of a shorthand summary slide as well. You can maybe have this pulled up when you're taking the quiz. Might be a good idea. It's open book, open notes. So I would suggest that. Here's the surplus shortage stuff that I said we'll start out with next class. And let's see at the very end here if we can get this to work today. And if not, then we'll talk about what we're going to do instead. So let's see if we can get this first question. So this should hopefully be fairly easy, right? We went through a lot of material here today. It's not, I'm aware of that, right? So if we go all the way back to the beginning of class, we talked about things that shift supply, right? So if I have the price of hops, a major input in beer production, if it increases, what's going to happen in the market for beer? So first of all, how many of us are not able to get in the top hat here? So still quite a few. So let me keep your hands up. So those of you who aren't in top hat, just to help me troubleshoot this, are you able to look at Amazon? So how many of you can't use the internet at all? Like you haven't been able to pull open Canvas or the slides? You can't? Canvas? So I'm specifically asking, regardless of top hat, who is not able to go on a website? Like you can't even go shopping and waste your time. So there's still like a lot of you. So you haven't been able to have the slides open on your computer. So why is your computer open? Well, I mean, like, have you been able, what have you been taking? Like, you can't use the internet, not just you specifically, but like you haven't been, the whole class, you haven't been able to use the internet at all?
You can download that.
Okay, but like, I know, but I'm just saying, like, I'm not cute. So you sometimes can get on it, sometimes can't. Okay, that's what I'm trying to get at. So I think it's a Wi-Fi issue, so that's why I'm asking these questions. I'm not like trying to be accusatory. I'm just asking like if you were able to at any point get on, so I know what to tell them, okay? All right, so it's not working for enough people, but we're gonna work through all these questions. I'm then gonna do what I did last class. I'm gonna put up what looks like a new assignment on Top Hat, which will be these same 4 questions we're gonna work through. So if you're paying attention, I'd maybe even write down the answers here. Because my goal is that if you showed up in class today, you should be able to get all 4 of those points, right? In fact, when I look at the grade book and I see people that didn't get 4 points, I probably know they weren't in class, right? So if I saw an increase in the price of an input, what's going to happen to my supply curve? It's going to decrease, right? Because my costs are high, I'm going to supply less. So we would see this leftward shift, right? So for this first one, got this answer here. For the second one, what if I expect, as the producer, I expect that the price of beer is going to be higher in the future? My current supply would decrease, right? So in both of these scenarios, we actually see that the supply is going to decrease, okay? Any questions over either of those before we kind of get to the next couple questions? Yep. So I've got kind of a bunch of different depictions here. You're not able to pull this open on your phone. This might be a little bit difficult to see. But if I'm thinking about, if I have the price of gasoline or the market for we're looking at the market for electric vehicles. If the price of gasoline powered vehicles all of a sudden increases, what's going to happen to the demand or supply, or what's going to happen to the, I'd have to tell you exactly what's going on here. So what did I leave out of this question that really needs to be included? Am I talking about consumers or producers, right? So when I wrote this question, I was assuming we're thinking about now consumers, right? So those first 2 questions were producers. Now we're going back to thinking about, well, we can see shifts in consumer as well, or shifts in demand. So if for consumers, they see the price of gasoline powered vehicles going up, what's going to happen to the demand for electric vehicles? So if gas powered vehicles are now more expensive, what are people more likely to do? Buy electric. So we're going to get a demand increase, or where is that at, right? A just rightward shift, okay? So here is going to be kind of our answer to this one, right? Now, if it was producers, if I was thinking about it through the producer's lens, what is going to happen to supply of electric vehicles? So if I'm a producer and gasoline powered vehicles are now higher price, what do I want to make? I want to make more gas powered vehicles. So electric powered vehicles, I would actually see the supply decrease, right? For substitutes in production, the companies want to make whatever good has a higher price. So if gasoline powered vehicles are now more expensive, I can make more money selling them. I want to have more of those on my car lot than I do electric vehicles, and the supply for electric vehicles would decrease. But for the sake of getting this question correct, I'm just using it to kind of show you different lenses. I was thinking of it through a consumer standpoint, so the answer here should be A, okay? And I'll update the question in the Top Hat assignment I put in there and include that word consumer just so we can kind of remind ourselves on that. All right. What if the government taxes the production of gasoline powered vehicles? So a tax is essentially a what? Increase in costs or my input prices. So if costs are higher, the producer is going to want to supply less, or I get a decrease in supply, which is a leftward shift, which would be down here. Okay. Any questions over any of those 4? Yeah. I'll explain. I know your question. So I can see that there are about 246 of you who are able to kind of log on. Not all of us answered. So before we start getting too loud, hold on for 1 second. Even if you were able to get a response in during class, you need to complete that extra assignment. This doesn't count for anything. This was just for me working through the problems and to do a little more troubleshooting today. You need, just give me another minute or 2, okay? You need to get on and complete that assignment before class starts next Tuesday. You have that quiz and you have the module reading due on Monday. Other than that, Any questions before we get out of here? Yeah. Yeah, I will also, that one that if anyone wasn't aware of that I used from last class, that looked like the extra assignment, when I, hopefully between classes, it might not be till closer to 1, just depending, because I have back-to-backs. I'll reopen that to the end of the day today, because I want everyone to have the opportunity to get those participation points, and I can see a few of you did. If you have any other questions, ask me after class. Have a fun, safe weekend, and I will see you guys on Tuesday.
Will the quiz open